We are going to really give you the opportunity to ask some of the big questions, or if there was a question that you didn't get to ask of an individual panel member, you can put it to a specific panel member. So I know, Charlie, you didn't get to ask a question earlier. Would you? You still got it in your mind? I know you've got it in your mind. Yes, we'll start with Charlie since we had to cut her off earlier. This is where our microphone bearers have to, they're really going to get their steps up across the room now.
Where was it? Between the two projects, you've now worked with about 180 farmers, if I'm doing my maths right. I would imagine that process is pretty full on for the farmers involved. There's a lot of data collection. With those farmers, what sort of decisions have they been making? Have they been using all of these reports that you've given them? What have they been using them for? Or are they like some of those farm business plans that we do for farmers that go in a drawer and never get pulled out again?
Is this on? I think you hold that question for the last session.
He's read the program.
where you can ask them directly. Not wanting to speak for the farmers that have been involved in our project that are in the room, but I do know of some examples where the farmers got their report and immediately used that to plan their next shelter belt. So they've used the shade and shelter map, for example, and said, oh, I can see there's a gap in my ecosystem provision here. That's where I'm going to put my next shelter belt. I know that a couple of farmers are, well, at least one that's used their account to, negotiate with supply chains to demonstrate that not necessarily their position, but that they're on this journey, the natural capital journey, that they're accounting for it, that they're involved in data collection and a process to quantify and measure it, so that you can't manage what you can't measure. So you start the measurement, that's the first step. So they've used that in supply chain negotiations, and also in negotiating exclusivity and exclusive agreements with producers, with supply chains to get their product as part of that exclusive source. So there's a couple of anecdotal experiences that both relate to on-ground management and supply chain use that we can refer to. But yeah, I'm keen to hear from the farmers in the room later this afternoon. Just full disclosure, there's not quite 180 because there's a bit of overlap between the two projects.
Indeed, I think we're at 130. The other element is that what was I going to say? No, forgotten.
Go on.
There was something about supply chain.
I just wanted to pick up something that Jim did highlight there too, which is that the great thing about this program, the work that both of you are so heavily involved in, is that it is an independent view of what is important to a farm business for their sustainability and how that contributes back to the wider economy. Because if you don't do this yourselves and from an independent lens and a science-based lens, set these standards in place, other people will definitely do it for you and are already doing it for you. And there's probably people in the room who already know this already, that there are actors in the supply chain, some of who are not the best intentioned actors, who will tell you what they want you to report on for your natural capital and your sustainability or your ESG, which suits them for their own reporting requirements. And in an ideal world, it would be about the why. It would be about making sure we are all reinvesting back into sustainable businesses. But for a lot of them, it is just about ticking a box to avoid regulatory penalty. And they'll design their own systems. And we can see some banks and some supply chains doing this. Some are doing it well and some are not doing it well, where they will say, this is the system I need you to comply to. And it might not suit you and it might not reflect your business very well. So this independent work is really, really crucial.
Thanks. We do have some anecdotal evidence that some farmers have taken their reports to banks and got beneficial interest rates on the basis of that as well.
Oh, good to know. We have an online question, Narelle.
Katie, I think this one would be for you. So how can we collaborate as a whole region to understand and operate within a water sealing capacity?
Why is that one for me? Okay, collaborating with the region. Look, it's a lot of what I've been hearing lately in terms of a policy perspective is taking a local lens to these really big scale problems. The terms that keep getting bandied around are place-based approaches, and recently in a fairly intensive discussion with Department of Ag and other agribusiness representatives, we kept hearing reflected back that a catchment-based approach was really important, because you're trying to look at what's happening within this region. It's not just about what's happening on your property and your neighbour's property or just downstream of that. It's about looking at what is suitable for the entire catchment. How you can better collaborate is coming along to things like this and making connections and swapping notes at the end of the day and saying, I'll follow that up with you on the weekend. Let's get something done about it. It is just, honestly, it's a human problem. It's not really so much the collaboration is not a resource problem. It's about making sure the right people are making connections to the other right people and just making a decision to get started.
Good question. From I suppose more a biophysical response to that, I think, and it sort of comes back to a question I think that Sophie asked. I think a lot of the natural capital assets and the indices that we generate as part of our accounts and as part of the Farming for the Future program, as I said before, could benefit from a regionalised context to them, and that would include things like I think that was inherent in that question, the water constrained environment or the asset base more broadly within the catchment that's available. So, yeah, my small contribution is that I think we can regionally contextualise the biophysical assets depending on the landscape or the catchment that a farm is located in, to provide a bit more depth to the understanding of how they're managing those assets and how they're contributing to the broader catchment scale.
I mean, there's probably many ways to do it, but one way would be to extend the natural capital account to the region or to the catchment probably would be a better geographic area and do just as Jim said within the context of, and that this is well documented and there are ways to do this, and the farm accounts can integrate back up into that landscape level account as well.
Great. We have a question up here. Yes.
Hi, thanks. Jack Hawdon from Fonterra. I'm interested, I walked away with the overwhelming feeling of data richness and perhaps knowledge poorness, right? How do we go to moving from that really rich and the win-win part, the double dividend part particularly, I really like that. How do we go from that to just having a drop-down list of interventions that make sense in most circumstances or in a given set of circumstances to really access a larger number of our suppliers and supplier base? Is that the next step, or are we going to need to do all of this data across the whole landscape?
We have to collect more data. We just can't go from what we've got to that, but that is where we need to get to. And I think, so yes, in the short term, it's more data. We haven't touched dairy, for instance, and we still need soil health indicators to do cropping. So we absolutely need to collect more data, but ultimately, yes, we need to be able to turn the data that we've created into advice for farmers. It still is likely to be bespoke for different farm, the individual farm. As we've shown, there's different responses that you're getting in different farm contexts. So we need to be alive to that and respond appropriately. And we believe the way to do that is to work through NRMs and farm advisors who can be the holders of that, detailed, more complicated information to be able to provide that direct advice to the individual bespoke farms.
I feel like you were eavesdropping on a conversation I had yesterday, which was basically what's the next, element of the research from this. And it was a horrendogram, but that state and transition model that I put up there, we focus very much on the states so the accounts are an assessment of the condition states. What you're talking about is what do you do in the transitions? So how do you move from one state to the next based on different management actions? And I think we don't have a really nice compiled set of what you need to do for each of these transitions, and that would be a good next step. That'd be a good project to have sort of those generalised responses if you want to, go in different particular directions. So I do think there is enough. It's not a case that the knowledge isn't there for those generalised things. It's a case of compiling that knowledge into a framework that's readily accessible. But I do agree with Ange that each farm will be, bespoke and specific depending on the particular constraints and context of that. So those farm advisors, the local NRM, landcare groups, landcare networks, community groups that can provide that specific knowledge is critical.
And I think the other thing that in agriculture we tend to sometimes fall into the trap of just collecting all the information, putting it in one place and go, there you go, you've got what you need, make a good decision now, and not putting enough investment and time into that social aspect. I mean, there's a whole lot of really great research, not to put too many jargon words back out into the room, but on decision fatigue. It's when you stand in the supermarket and you go, why are there 17 different products? I just need to choose between 3. That applies to these kinds of things exponentially. When it's a decision that's really important and impactful, then it might change the way that, your business runs in the next few years. It's really a common human response to be paralysed by that decision and hope someone else will do it, that you can follow their example. And there's other things that exist across Australian agriculture, but just Australian culture in particular, like status quo bias. We all have we feel like we're quite open-minded. We're generally fairly conservative people. We are risk-averse. We live in a very challenging physical environment, so we play our cards close and make sure that we've got the decisions sorted before we go ahead and make a move. And we don't put enough energy and time into those behavioural aspects of helping people get past the hurdle of so much knowledge. What do I do with the knowledge? How am I going to get to the next step? So that's important for us to focus on, and events like this can really hopefully help get past some of those barriers too. And my takeaway from that is when you hear all the information on a day like this and you go home, don't just go, oh my God, what am I going to do with that? Pick 1 or 2 things that are meaningful to you that you can make a start on. You don't have to do all of this tomorrow. You do have to do some of it soon, but you can pick what's meaningful and impactful for you to get a start on, and pick some people in the room that you can help, go on that, I hate the word journey, but go on that journey with and say, look, if I do this and if you give that a go, let's give it a shot together and take a few first steps.
Fantastic. I know we could have a very quick one. It'll have to be a quick one.
My comment is that we perhaps as farmers need to become more marketers once we've got the data to market our product. But my question really is, what's the rest of the world doing? Like, where do we sit in terms of what are they doing in that space?
Good question. The Farming for the Future data set, it's not speaking for you, Ange, is the largest of its kind in the world. So it's right out there in terms of leading edge, in terms of demonstrating this direct connection between farm performance in terms of profitability and production efficiency with natural capital measures. I suppose that the big global huge picture that Katie sort of covered in terms of that we know that there's regulatory frameworks and either being voluntary or mandatory coming down, either existing or coming down the line. I don't know particularly how well other farming sectors are prepared for that in other parts of the world. I think that Australian farmers generally are pretty proactive and reasonably cognizant of these issues. Generally, there's obviously it's going to be sectors that are more so than others. So I suppose I'm reasonably optimistic that the Australian farming community is well prepared, or as prepared as any other, for these changes.
And likewise, the Australian Agricultural Sustainability Framework is the first of its kind in the world to look at a country-specific agricultural sustainability lens, and it's also unique in that it takes an outcomes-based approach where most sustainability initiatives in agriculture particularly look at prescribed practices. So the European view particularly, and partially this bleeds into the American view, some of the Asian countries, is that they pick a particular practice that they have decided is sustainable and then legislate for that. And sometimes it's sustainable and sometimes it's not, and they don't really check the perverse outcomes before they go ahead and just pass the law because they're responsive. It's a very different kind of parliament to ours. It's much more fragmented. It's much more easily moved by activist and community responses. So they do tend to be very just reactive and knee-jerk and go, well, we'll do this and we'll make it X number of butterflies for field without checking how is that actually going to make a difference in the long term. And of course, then they subsidise, which we don't do. We don't like to have those perverse outcomes in markets. So the Australian Ag Sustainability Framework helps put a shared values approach to that, rather than saying it will be X number of butterflies, or it will be organic butter, or it will be a particular kind of animal welfare practice. It says we value animal welfare, here's how we value animal welfare, and here are the different ways across different production regions and systems across the diversity of Australian agriculture that we approach animal welfare, which might be different to how you do it in the Netherlands or in Brazil or in China. But as long as we can all agree that we want better animal welfare, let's start there and then work backwards to the different ways we do it. So we're prepared in that sense, and not every farmer is at the same level on that, but Australian agriculture as an industry is very, very proactive in a global sense.